I'd like to welcome all of you to AAPOR, to the dinner, and then now we're going to have the plenary. And remember, as soon as the plenary is done, we'll have the dessert reception. Only requirement is that you remain in the room for the plenary, okay? Now, this plenary is inspired by comments made during the last two presidential addresses at AAPOR. Betsy Martin, in 2004, in her speech, Unfinished Business, remarked about response rates, quote, I'm not the first AAPOR president to address this issue, but it sure would be great if I were the last. I'm not talking about this because it's my favorite topic or because I think it's the most important threat to survey quality. I think that measurement error is a more important threat to survey quality. I think that measurement error is a more important source of bias, and that we are investing far too little in question development and testing. A year earlier, Mark Schulman, in Towards a New Research Relevancy, winning our seat at the table, noted, quote, I fear that we risk marginalizing our profession when we become too narrowly focused on reaching certain survey research benchmarks, such as response rate calculations. AAPOR's emphasis on standardizing response rate reporting, while critically important, has had another and perhaps unintended consequence for many researchers, elevating the response rate to seemingly the most crucial factor in judging the quality of their research. Mark went on to say, I do not want to mobilize the AAPOR response rate police to hunt me down. I fear that our sometimes obsession with response rate as the major measure of survey precision may be distracting us by establishing a measurable but limited standard. Now, Betsy and Mark are both right. Response rate's not all that matter, and not what matter most. First, this is recognized by AAPOR in its newly revised standards for minimal disclosure. Our code lists 20 elements of a survey that need to be documented and shared with others. Response rates are but one item on this list of important methodological considerations, no less nor no more important than the others. Second, this is demonstrated by the total survey error perspective that recognizes that survey quality rests on how all parts of a survey are designed and executed, and that the ways in which error interact and accumulate across stages of survey are complex and important to understand. Tonight, we will hear about total survey error perspective from our notable speakers. The main presentation will be by Bob Groves from the ISR, University of Michigan, followed by comments, and then we hope to have some time for possibly questions. Bob.
Let's see, before I begin, I think we should reflect, or you should reflect on where you are at the moment. We're in a wonderful hotel. We just had a great meal. We're feet away from a lovely beach in the pounding surf of the Atlantic Ocean. And you're sitting here listening to me talk about total survey error. Let me tell you what I'm going to do tonight. We'll do a little historical review about the concept. I'll do strengths and weaknesses, I guess weaknesses and strengths. And then a few comments on the future and what I think ought to be done. Things begin in the total survey error perspective in a very early paper, 1944, by the same Deming that is the quality Deming. He actually worked in surveys in his early days. Believe it or not, this paper is in the American Sociological Review. I can't believe that you could ever get anything like that published in a sociology journal these days. And let me show you the pages from this. Those of you in the back I know cannot see this, and so I'm going to try to tell you some notable things. The ellipses here are kind of surprising things he noted. This is a list of things that are very familiar to you. Variability in response, these are kind of mode effects. And down here he says the bias of the auspices. So he's actually worried about sponsor effects at that point. And then way over here are things that we don't talk about much anymore. Biases arising from late reports, although today we call that timeliness issues. Biases arising from an unrepresentative selection of the date for the survey. That's kind of cool. And then down here are processing errors that you're going to see as the history goes on we kind of forgot about for a few decades. He includes the usual things, but he includes, and this is real important for this field, I think, some non-statistical notions like this auspices of the survey sponsor. And then he includes estimation step errors. His example was bad weighting. He omits what we now call coverage errors, a mismatch between the sampling frame and the target population, and he doesn't use this term, total survey error. A lot of the early texts that mention error are statistical texts. I chose one, and to give you a sense of the relative size of the treatment, it's about a 10% treatment on what Leslie called non-sampling errors, and he has a little graphic on biases only. This actually, I think, is the first breakdown that I've seen like this in the literature. A couple of notable things. He first, in print anyway, in a text notion, uses this phrase, non-sampling biases. I don't like non-sampling. To me, that's sort of like calling economists, auto mechanics, and surgeons non-anthropologists. It's correct, it just doesn't give much information, right? So we now know that non-sampling errors are non-response and measurement and all sorts of other things. Now what does he do up here? He distinguishes something that was of great concern in the time, frame biases from non-coverage, and these were things that disrupted the sampling step, duplicate items in a frame or clusters of items. And then this is a historical note that we don't talk about much anymore. There was great concern in the early days at this time among samplers about estimators that had built-in technical biases, like a ratio mean we now know is, or we know is a biased estimate of the population mean. But what Kish gave us was this initial breakdown, I think. Then in the book that who everyone covets as the title, Total Survey Error, this is really an empirical study, but they do the bracketing even more. This is almost the fully elaborated scheme, breaking variable error from biases on the left, then in the bias side, sampling and non-sampling, that's pretty consistent. Their first breakout of non-observation and observational errors. That's their contribution, I think. Then in my book in '89, I tried to take on something else, and that was trying to bring together a couple of different literatures on error. One was from psychometrics with the survey side, and then just a little on econometrics. To my embarrassment, I didn't treat processing error either, but I did a pretty, I broke at variance and bias first. And this chart is a mess, and just look at what I think is yellow for you. Do you have yellow boxes? This was my statement of what psychometrics misses. All of the yellow boxes are generally outside the sphere of attention of most traditional psychometrics. And in the sphere are things that are basically observational errors, on the validity and reliability side up here. So the main import of that one is, there. The next book is called Non-Sampling Error in Surveys. This is Judy Lessler and Bill Kalsbeck. And to understand this book and its emphasis on what was then called total survey design, the origins of this were really an effort to take the total survey error perspective and do something about it. Why don't we actually design surveys that minimize total survey error at once? They too omit processing error, but their contributions, I think, are really quite important. On the non-response error side, they are the first in kind of a full treatment to make this distinction between deterministic and stochastic views of non-response. This is a big deal for us. If you read the early literatures in non-response, the basic assumption was that there were a group of respondents and there were a group of non-respondents. The non-respondents were basically permanent. That was a permanent characteristic of that subgroup. We don't believe that anymore, and we don't believe it for important reasons. We know that some people are respondents sometimes and non-respondents others, so it's much more attractive to think of a stochastic or a random view of non-response, and they're really the first to lay this out. And then importantly, the last note is that they address a real problem in the field of total survey error, and that is that if you really want estimates of the components, you generally have to make pretty big design changes that are expensive. You have to introduce randomization in ways that are unusual and burdensome, and they talk about what you do if you don't do that. In a very recent book, Paul Biemer, who's right here at the end, and Lars Leiberg have made a new contribution, and that is they bring in three different notions that are modern views, what I think of as modern views of quality. First, specification error, which is really the statistical notion that's quite akin to construct validity in psychometrics. But then they bring in process quality in a big way. They introduce what is, I guess, the agreed upon notion of quality in most process viewpoints, and that is fitness for use, and I'll build on that in a minute. They do bring in processing error. So this is a great book. You should read this book, especially in the processing error side, because it's alone in a good treatment of that. Then in a book that's a few months after that, I and my colleagues tried to map error into practical steps that we go through in a survey, and to make the basic observation that we really have twin inferential processes that we're involved in. We get an answer from a respondent, and we want that answer to inform our understanding of some construct that's applied to them. And then we have an inference based on the respondents to the target population. And so the kind of mapping that goes on in that kind of thing is to think of errors as gaps. This is the two-prong inferential process of surveys. On the left hand, we're going from way at the bottom, edited data, all the way up to a construct. The ellipses are gaps that are basically error notions of different kinds. And on the right is the representational inference, where you go from respondents all the way up to some inferential population. And the weaknesses in what we do are the ellipses, are the errors. And so our job as practitioners is to make those gaps as small as possible. Now, there's a big division in the literature. This is the New Yorker thing. To survey statisticians, if you consume this literature, it's all about bias. It's all about variance, sorry. They'll talk about bias from time to time, but they pretty quickly fall asleep because it's statistically uninteresting. It's all about the variance, and to a lot of the practitioners, it's all about the bias, and the variance is not too interesting. That's a big division in the field that needs to be repaired by people who can walk across bridges or build bridges across all those bodies of water. Let me sum up on the evolution. The roots of this are sort of a revolt against thinking of sampling error as the only error we worry about. Tom mentioned this. The framework conceptually involves both statistical and non-statistical notions. We lose sight of that from time to time. Most of the statistical attention is on variance, most of it on measurement error variance. And there are things that occurred in the history late. This 1970s attention to total survey design, which we've kind of lost a little, I think, at least in the scientific literature. And then something that happened in the 80s and the 90s, a real attempt to import psychometric notions. So we're actually seeing right now a whole class of models from psychometrics being applied to survey data, and that's really good, I think. There are a lot of omissions in research we have to worry about. Let me do weaknesses and strengths. On the weakness side, number one, I think, is that the notion as historically evolved misses things. And what is really importantly missing, I think, is a user perspective. Let me illustrate that. I'm involved in an effort now that's attempting to develop a set of key national indicators for the country. And notions of quality here so this will be a set of statistical indicators. There are four notions of quality that seem to predominate the evaluation of this process. One called credibility, one called relevance, one called estimator quality, and the other called data quality. And I'm going to show you I'm going to roll this chart out a bit and show you how small a portion of this quality space total survey error really is. So let's look at quality. These are notions that have to do, or let's look at credibility first. These are notions that are subjective judgments by the user about the source of the data and the utility of the data for their purposes. If you look at these words, you know these are not statistical notions, right? And users can vary. You can take the same statistic and use it for a different purpose, and you'd make different judgments on this, right? So fitness for use works pretty well here as a notion. On relevance, we get these kinds of words that come up, and these two basically are unmeasurable kinds of things. Timeliness comes pretty close to being measurable, but most of the other things are subjective judgments. There's no total survey error stuff here yet. When we hit estimator quality, then we kick in. Notions of accuracy come into play, and most of the words you saw in the historical development fit under this. And this is basically the statistical viewpoint, the survey statistical viewpoint. Then when you go to data quality, you pick up the psychometric viewpoint that we're worried about the quality of an answer, not the quality of an estimate for a population. So total survey error is a little piece of this space. We have not grappled with this. This audience, however, represents different groups that grapple with it differently. So from the producer side on survey statistic, we worry about reliability, validity, and then accuracy. For the user side of survey statistics, they're actually much more interested in credibility and relevance. And we need more of those people, and we need to get more involved in use to understand this, I think. Second weakness, there's the assertion that there's no routine measurement on these multiple error components, basically because total survey error is viewed as unimportant. And so there's some assertions, if you get the sampling error right, you know, that really does dominate the error space. And if you measured it well, you're in pretty good shape. On the other hand, there are at least 5 myths that I think that we know are myths only because of a total survey error perspective. The first one, the first myth is non-response rates are everything. This is sort of like Tom and Betsy and Mark's talk and Norman's talk a long time ago. And the second myth is that non-response rates don't matter. Both of those are wrong. I want to give you an example of this a little later. 3, the notion that we ought to give as many cases as we can to the good interviewers, as many as they can work. We know that's wrong. It's only because of these models on interviewer variance that we know this. Whether we practice this or not is a different issue because of cost pressures. Fourth, post-survey adjustments eliminate non-response error. That's a myth, even though we do it routinely. But the assumption that we can remove non-response error through post-survey adjustments clearly isn't correct. Five, that usual standard errors reflect all the sources of instability in the estimates. So when SPSS or SAS calculates a standard error, it includes all these measurement error variance components. Well, that isn't right. It may include little pieces of them, but you won't know what fraction of the total is there. Third weakness. Ineffective influence on professional standards. Now, there are changes going on in this part of the audience that does federal surveys, because OMB will soon announce a requirement to mount non-response bias studies if you are mounting a survey that is expecting less than an 80% response rate. So this is going to change professional standards by mandate, I think. I can't wait to see what actually happens. But let me tell you what a sad state we're in terms of practice regarding non-response. Just go through 4 steps of logic. We teach ourselves and our students that probability sampling inference is unbiased from non-response sources with 100% response rate, right? We know that. You can demonstrate that. Second observation, response rates are falling. Third observation, if you read Keeter et al. And Curtin et al. And Merkel and Edelman, a good reader gets the notion that, gee, response rates don't matter in the same way we used to think they matter. And then finally, standard practice urges maximizing response rates. You know, these 4 things just don't compute. I mean, they're almost internally contradictory. So what do we do? Well, let's take a little gander at the literature. There are two ways of looking at non-response error on a simple statistic like a sample mean. Y bar sub r here, way to the left, is the mean of the respondents. That's what we're stuck with. Y bar sub n is the mean of the full sample. That's what we really covet. We'd really want to know that. And the difference between the two can be expressed by this term that has 2 factors, an m over n, which is the non-response rate, the missing over the full sample, and then a difference term. Well, with a little work on this and taking a stochastic view of non-response, you can derive the next expression, which says the bias is really a function of the covariance between y and p. What's p? P is the response propensity. So this says that non-response bias grows when the correlation between what you're measuring, y, and the propensity to respond is big. It's a bad thing to have response propensities related to the survey variables. We've told ourselves this for a while. And the p-bar is just the mean response propensity. So what if you take this and say, gee, what do we know as a field about this? Well, if you look at this, the key issue is whether influences on survey population on survey participation are shared with the influences on the survey variables. What is that covariance term? And actually, we ought to be thinking about that causally. What causes response propensities? What causes Ys? Are the causes shared? It does mean that increased non-response rates don't necessarily imply increased non-response error. My favorite study in all this literature is one that Dan Merkel and Murray Edelman did in an exit poll in, I don't know, 91 or something like this, where there is an incentive experiment that is a pen, I believe. It was a ballpoint pen with the logos of the networks on it. It was an incentive experiment that worked. The response rate went up. Wonderful success. demonstrated you could get higher response rate. But then when the authors did the same analysis they did in their 2002 chapter, that is, to look at the value of the Democrat versus Republican voting among the respondents versus the voting place totals, what happened? Well, the higher response rate condition had worse estimates. What happened? Well, the Democrats liked the pins. The Republicans didn't. It's a wonderful story, right? It's a case where response rates were increased. You know, you'd write home to your parents and say, I really did it. And you created estimates that were less good than the lower response rate. So we have to figure out when this occurs. Recently, I had a great time reading a bunch of studies that had pretty properly designed non-response rate bias analyses. They're kind of weird studies because they had record bases on them. You could really know the truth for the entire sample base. And so I thought this was kind of a neat set of studies. And you can do a little analysis on this study. You can calculate that expression at the bottom. That's the absolute value of a ratio. On the numerator is the difference between the respondent mean and the non-respondent mean. That's the non-response bias term. And then I just standardized it by the actual value on the full sample. So you could think of that as absolute relative non-response bias, okay? And the question that you might ask is this at all related to the non-response rate? Right? We've been telling each other that it has been. And here's what the 30 studies give you. So how do you read this chart? The x-axis is the non-response rate. As you go from left to right, you get depressed, okay? So the first thing, look at the x-axis. These are studies that have response rates that are pretty yucky. You know, there's a lot of low response rate studies. I don't have any examples that get response rates that are greater than like 85% or so. So the right portion, the left portion of the graph is kind of empty. The y-axis is this absolute relative bias. We know that there's a point on this chart, right? Everything goes through the origin, right? The 0, 0 point is what happens when you get 100% response rate by definition. So everything we know, if you had 100% response rate, must go here. We've been telling ourselves, damn it. We've been telling ourselves that as you go from left to right, things should get higher and higher. You don't see that, right? Here's another way to look at it. Take a point on the x-axis and let your eye go from the bottom to the top. Those are basically single studies. Right? A study has its own particular response rate. Look at the variability in non-response error within a study. It is vast. It's huge. Why is that? Well, that covariance term is all over the place. Sometimes the influences that produce the response propensity are the same that influence the y value. Sometimes it has nothing to do with y, and it doesn't matter. So you look at let me take your eye way up to the top numbers. Some of the top numbers are things like this. One of the top, the highest non-response biases come from the Consumer Expenditure Survey, or the Survey of Consumer Finances, sorry. The statistic is median income among a group that is sampled to the frame that includes IRS records. This is a survey where part of the frame comes from the IRS, so you actually know their reported income. What's happening to that statistic is it's a horrible underestimate of median income among these people. The rich people are disproportionately non-responding in a big way. This is like a 50 to 60% error on the median income. Vast. Another point way up there is a contingent valuation survey of users of a recreational lake. The statistic of interest is, do you own a residence on the lake? It's a horrible overestimate of that statistic because lake residents are disproportionately respondents. Okay, so what do you take from all of this? One, it's not that non-response error doesn't exist, and I'm not claiming that Keeter et al., Curtin et al., and Merkel and Edelman said that, but I do claim that some readers of those articles think that. That's not what's going on. It's that non-response rates aren't very good predictors of non-response error, okay? And that every statistic, every estimate in a survey is its own problem, whether non-response error exists or not. And third, although I don't show this in this chart, my belief is that we really got to get serious about collecting and getting auxiliary variables to help us gauge non-response error. All right, that was weakness number 3. Weakness number 4 is that there's a real large burden on the total survey error paradigm. The reason that we're all still just estimating sampling error is because it's really expensive to estimate this other stuff. And so interpenetration, that is random assignment of interviewers to workloads, and re-interviews for variance estimation for measurement error, typically are not done because they cost money. We have failed as a group, I think. I think it's kind of embarrassing that we've done this too, to not take advantage of centralized phone interviewing setups where there's near interpenetration. It's very close to being random assignment to interviewers within shifts. And so we could have estimators that could elaborate the sampling variance to make it a sampling plus interviewer variance component, and we just aren't doing that in practice. 5, there are patently wrong assumptions within some of these models. Most of them assume that there's no correlation between the true value of on the measurement error side, between the true value and the errors. And we just know that, we just have tons of examples where that isn't true, like drug use reports or income or all sorts of things where we know that how you behave, the kind of response error you make really is driven by what value you have on the variable that's being measured, and the models are just not reflecting these things. An example on this that works pretty well is the traditional interviewer variance model, which says we inflate the standard error of a mean due to interviewer variability as a function of a little row here, which is an interclass correlation due to interviewers, and M, which is the workload. This looks like a little design effect due to the interviewer. And we've often, as a field, I think, misinterpreted this by saying, gee, if we reduced M, we could reduce the interviewer variance effect. So we ought to give interviewers small workloads, even though that means we got to hire more interviewers, but that would be a good thing on the variance. This model assumes that that row term is invariant across workload size, but we actually know that isn't true, right? We see ourselves hiring new interviewers who aren't as good in their early workload as they become in their later workload. That is, M and rho are actually related to one another in a real way. So this model doesn't reflect reality. What are the strengths? One, the total survey error perspective really is our taxonomy in this field for the decomposition of errors. It gives us a language, an important language. Once clients get the language, once you teach them the language, you can work with them to improve survey quality and go beyond the question of how many cases am I going to get, which is their first question usually. Secondly, it separates phenomena affecting statistics in different ways. Variance and bias is an important distinction. Observation versus non-observational errors are important distinctions, and so on. That's good for us to be able to break down the process of error production. 3, it really is a conceptual foundation of the field of survey methodology. It's the way we think about quality. And some of us now are spending time with new PhD students in survey methodology, and they sort of self-label as what error they're working on. You know, I'm a measurement error guy, or I'm a non-response guy. So, you know, the field is basically elaborating itself around this conceptual framework. Gee, I apologize for this word, but okay, it's a tool to identify gaps in the research literature. And here, talk about an area that's been ignored. Processing error is just out the window. There are very few serious pieces of work on how many errors we induce in an edited data set through the processing steps, and it's just wide open for a young person to build a career, I think. Okay, what do we need in the future, in my belief? One, there is another field just open, right? What have we done as a community over the last 20 years? Well, we have imported a set of cognitive and social psychological principles. We've done randomized experimental designs to really indicate a set of causal factors that affect response behavior. And we're stuck with statistical models that are uninformed by those theories. So one piece of work, it's probably a 10-year career, I think, would be reading all of the papers that we've all read in cognitive psychology and survey measurement, and parameterize those in terms of statistical models, and enrich the error models based on theories rather than on variance components that assume nothing about the causal mechanisms. Two, we need research on the interplay of two or more error sources jointly. My favorite here is the nexus between non-response and measurement error. Okay, so what do we do? Because we think non-response rates are really important, we really work quite hard on reluctant respondents to gain their cooperation, sometimes at the expense, perhaps, of their attention to the respondent task. So interviewers sometimes negotiate down the response burden in order to get cooperation, and then we don't know what's happening with the quality of the data. This is a basically open field, I think. It's a tough data, you need an elaborated data structure to take it on, but it's really important now, right? We are beating up people even more diligently than we used to. And if high response propensity, once overcome through persuasion, produces high measurement error, low response propensity produces high measurement error, we're in trouble. So that's an open area. 3, research on the interplay of biases and variances, and I think this would be a great bridge between the statistical and social science side. We don't know whether simple response variance, or reliability, if you will, accompanies, some increase in that accompanies response bias reductions. If we get more accurate reporting in terms of bias, do we get more reliable reporting, or do we get reporting of less reliability over repeated measurement? 4, we're importing right now models that are latent class models, models that are item response theory models, a variety of covariance analysis models, and a lot of those models, when applied to survey data, are just identified models. You can estimate one model with the data, and we don't have very good diagnostic tools to study the properties of those models. We really need them. 5, Bruce Spencer has a thoughtful piece that's really a deeply profound issue we have. How much should we spend on measuring quality versus improving quality? Measuring quality costs money. The money we spend measuring quality could be spent in improving quality. What's the trade-off on that? And I don't think that's a statistical question. It's sort of a value judgment of how important it is to know how good something is versus making it good. And I don't know what to do about this, but I'm perplexed by number 5. 6, integrating other notions of quality in the total survey error paradigm. Somebody really ought to take on this fitness for use. It seems to me that thoughtful folks from the market research and commercial side, where clients are making decisions on survey data, are the best positioned to do this, because there the use of the survey data is in a body of other facts. The survey estimate is only one estimate that is used, one piece of information that's used to inform a much larger decision. So the notion of how the use affects the needed quality of the estimates, I think, would be, should come out of that domain. 7, all of us think that we're moving to a multiple mode, multiple frame, multiple phase world, a world that's pretty complex, where surveys are going to be done in a lot of different ways for different people over different times. And we got to prepare the error models that describe that world. I think this is permanent employment for total survey errorists, or whatever you call them. Summary. The evolution of this notion has both statistical and non-statistical roots. It's important to remember that. There are weaknesses here, design burdens, really complex estimators if you take the statistical side alone. There are very strong conceptual strengths, I think, of the framework, because it points us in the direction of work we need to do. And on the future side, the mixed mode clearly demands this perspective, in my belief. And I end with one of my favorite quotes from Leslie Kish in 1977. Thank you.
We will now have 2 commentators. I describe them as commentators rather than discussants, because while they may well remark about some of the things that Bob has shared with us tonight, they are really going to comment on the concept and the aspects of total survey error, rather than just pick apart this gentleman. And I almost neglected to introduce Paul Biemer here tonight.
I need no introduction. Thank you. Thank you very much. You know, as I was listening to Bob, I realized that I'm probably a poor choice for a discussant for this topic, not because it's not a topic that's near and dear to my heart, but because I agree so much with Bob that there'll be very little controversy in my comments. You know, congratulations to Bob. I think the field really did need this paper. It's a very thorough and provocative examination of total survey error theory and practice. Bob traces the history of total survey error research from the 1940s to the present, and he goes into some detail in summarizing the current best practices in the field. As you heard, you know, he lays out a very challenging and insightful agenda for the future. And he contributes to the debate that began, I guess, at least for me, last March when we held a total survey error workshop in Washington, D.C. that was supported by the National Institute for Statistical Sciences. And during that workshop, there were questions about, you know, why do we want to try to quantify total survey error? What would be the purpose of that? What would we get out of attaching a number to a statistic and saying this is the total survey error? How would we use it for inference, for example? Are the models that we use for estimating total survey error useful for achieving survey quality? And what have these models really added to our knowledge about how to do survey research? Bob also raises questions about whether the models are even making the right assumptions. He goes through a number of strengths and weaknesses of the framework, He mentions that this total survey error modeling framework allows us to focus attention on specific error sources so we can direct our efforts towards maybe having separate studies to estimate each component. And in that way, rather than trying to attack the whole problem of total survey error, breaking it down into its component parts makes the job a little easier. It also highlights the division between bias and variance, emphasizes that some sources of error contribute more to the bias, some contribute more to the variance, some contribute to both. I wouldn't call this an omission, but one thing that Bob didn't emphasize, but I know he is very concerned about this because he's written books on this, is the idea of using a total survey error model for survey design optimization. I think, to me, this is one of the central innovations that come out of the total survey error framework, and that is that when we plan a survey, what we're really trying to do is to take scarce resources, survey cost, the timing of a survey, and so forth, and we try to allocate those across all the different operations in a survey design in such a way that we're trying to minimize the total mean squared error of a statistic. And I think this is a really key concept in the survey design, and one that Lars and I try to emphasize in our book. He talks about the weaknesses of the total survey error modeling framework, mentions a lot of the deficiencies of the assumptions, and as we move more towards sort of using these models for things like statistical adjustments, these assumptions really loom large and limiting our ability to use these models. Also mentions how the field, that means us, have failed to really convert the theory that's behind and what the theory suggests about how to practice survey methodology and converting that to actual practice. For example, many studies, because perhaps of resources or maybe just inattention to other sources of error, tend to just focus on a single source of error rather than trying to estimate two or more sources of error simultaneously from the same study. And I think we miss something important when we do that. And I'll talk more about that in a minute. So why do we want to estimate multiple error sources simultaneously? Well, as I mentioned, Bob mentioned, the goal of survey design is to minimize the total survey error, not just a single source. So we're not just interested in trying to reduce the non-response bias, but we're trying to minimize total survey error. It is also possible that when we measure error at some aggregate level, that we're getting a false notion about the size of the error because one source of error could be mitigated by other sources. So you could have offsetting biases, and I'll show you an example of that. A single design feature could affect bias and variance, and also could affect multiple error sources. So, for example, interviewer training would have an effect on the interviewer variance. It could also have an effect on non-response error, non-response bias, and measurement bias. So it can really be more than just an evaluation of, say, interviewer variance when you're looking at training methods. The interactions of two or more error sources can provide, as we'll see, valuable information about the causes of the error, or at least it raises questions about the interactions that would beg for further research in an area and could lead to more information and a better understanding of the nature of the errors. Now, Bob didn't talk about this model, but this model is his model, is one of the models that we were talking about as we were exchanging notes for this presentation. And basically what this model is showing is how it is possible for the response propensity P to be, which is the idea of behind the non-response bias. It's the correlation between the response propensity and a survey characteristic leads to non-response bias. So P is related to the outcome variable Y, the true value, which causes a non-response bias, but may also be related to the measurement error. And when I saw this model, it got me thinking about some work that I had done a few years ago where I tried to estimate non-response bias and measurement bias for a survey. And I think we succeeded in getting some indications of both of those error components, both of those biases for the National health interview survey. This study was conducted in Texas and California because we were using the health interview survey face-to-face interviews, and those are the two largest states. And in this experiment, we wanted to compare the measurement and non-response biases for a parallel survey which was conducted by random digit dialing with the HIS face-to-face interviewing. So we estimated, we did some re-interviews for both the face-to-face and for the telephone survey. And through a model-based approach using latent class analysis, we were able to get some estimates of measurement bias from these re-interviews. And we also did a non-response follow-up study, or follow-back interviews, to be able to estimate non-response bias. And we were, through this follow-back procedure, we were able to get the response rates up to, nearly 98%, something like that. So we had a pretty good estimate, I think, of the non-response bias. I don't have the time to go into all the details. There's a lot of theory that goes into this, the construction of these estimates, but you can read this in my paper. The face-to-face survey had, we were using the Healthy Person 2000 supplement for the HIS. So this was a supplement to the HIS survey, not the HIS itself. So the response rate was around 81% for the HIS face-to-face, and for RDD it was around 61%. So about a 20 percentage point difference between the response rates for RDD and face-to-face interviewing. This is an example of the types of tables that we provided for a number of questions that we estimated that we apply these models to. For example, do you now smoke cigarettes every day, some days, or not at all? You can see the second column there is our gold standard estimate, which has been adjusted for non-response bias and measurement bias. And then we have the measurement bias and the non-response bias estimates for RDD. And the last two columns we have measurement bias and non-response bias for face-to-face. So if you sum up measurement bias and non-response bias, you would get something like the total bias for RDD, and you could compare that with the total bias for face-to-face. And a lot of times when we do mode comparison studies, that's really what we're looking at, is sort of the total, the differences between the total biases. And what we attempted to do here is to try to decompose that difference into differences that are due to measurement bias and differences that can be attributed to non-response bias. So anyway, that's what the data look like, and we had about 31 items that we did this for. Wish we had done more now. But so the data are what we're presenting in this table basically are averaged over 31 items. One of the things, and you can see the rows relate to the RDD and the face-to-face, and one of the things I want to point out is the last column, which is the absolute total bias. So this is actually summing together measurement bias and non-response bias and just taking the absolute value of that, averaging over the 31 items and then comparing it with RDD and face-to-face. And you can see that even though RDD had a lower response rate, 61% relative to 81% for face-to-face, the total biases for these two sources seemed very close. In fact, it looked like face-to-face even had a slightly larger total bias. But when you look at the detail, you can understand why. Just as we would predict, the higher the response rate, the lower the bias due to non-response, and we can see that in these data. For face-to-face, the absolute non-response, the average bias, non-response bias was 1.6 percentage points. These are all categorical data items, I should add. So we're measuring these as percentages. And for RDD, it's 2.4. So you had a higher non-response bias. But if you look at the measurement bias, you see it kind of flip-flops a little, and you have a lower measurement bias for RDD than you do face-to-face, not that much lower. But that doesn't explain why you would get sort of this higher total bias for face-to-face. What's happening here is, in fact, that we have in the case of face-to-face, that when we add non-response bias and measurement bias together, the signs of the bias tend to be alike. So the biases tend to accumulate. Whereas when we sum together non-response and measurement bias for RDD, their signs don't necessarily need to be, aren't alike, and they don't accumulate. They're more likely to be offsetting. And you can see this in a couple of graphs that I've done here. It's just basically just plotting the bias estimates for non-response bias versus measurement bias. This is for face-to-face mode over the 31 items, and you can see that there's looks like a correlation between non-response bias and measurement bias. The signs seem to be similar, the magnitudes seem to be similar. In fact, there's a correlation of around 0.65 when you just run a Pearson's R-squared on these, and it's highly statistically significant. But what's interesting is you look at this for face-to-face and then switch to RDD, and you don't see that pattern at all at RDD. That is, you don't see that correlation between non-response bias and measurement bias. So what we can say here is that for face-to-face response and classification error propensities, which classification error propensities drives the measurement error bias, they're correlated, and so the non-response measurement bias tend to accumulate, whereas for RDD, they're uncorrelated, and there's more opportunity for those two biases to cancel out. But there's a deeper question here, and that is, why do we see these differences by mode and correlation between non-response and measurement bias? So this is what I'm talking about in terms of looking at multiple error sources simultaneously. So some of the things that I wanted to just sort of summarize with are that, just reiterating what Bob is saying, that non-response rate is a very poor measure, as we've seen in these tables anyway. It's a very poor measure of overall data quality. It's been used that way, I think, by a lot of people, looking at a response rate sort of as saying, how well did you do in your survey? But it's being misused that way. At least in this survey, however, it was useful for as an indicator of non-response bias. That is what we would expect, that is the higher response rate gave a lower non-response bias. We saw that with the HIS RDD comparison. What also we found in this study was that measurement bias was considerably larger than non-response bias. So again, sort of echoing what Betsy Martin was saying last year and others, that we may be focusing on the wrong component. At least this study would suggest that you've got a bigger problem. I mean, both of these are not small biases, but there's a larger problem associated with measurement bias than non-response bias. And this is true for both modes. And the differences in correlations between response and classification error propensities by mode, these things need to be explored. I'm not sure what the meaning is and what it means when these correlations are, it's 0.6 for one mode and 0 for another. But I hope you'll agree it's a pretty cool result. So thank you.
Okay, and our second commentator will be Ken Rasinski from NORC.
Where's the, okay. This is my punishment for coming late. I have to try to find PowerPoint. Oh. Now I have to try to find my talk. Can you scroll? Because I hate using this touchpad. I'll give my formal apologies as soon as I get everything loaded here. There we go. Hope there's nothing embarrassing that is coming up on this.
You mean that one website you're busy?
Well, that worked out better than I had imagined. I apologize for coming in late. I apologize to Tom and to the rest of you. There was a mix-up. Anyway, I hope I don't have to apologize for my talk. I chose a topic, the usefulness of survey data, which is sort of the flip side of error, because I knew I couldn't possibly out-error Bob and Paul, except perhaps in my reasoning. By usefulness, I meant that in spite of error that we might not completely understand, survey data can still give us a lot of information. And for the presentation, I'm going to go through quickly a lot of the problems and innovations improving survey questionnaire and questionnaire design. And of course, I'm going to miss a lot of innovation, so I apologize for that too. Now let's see, how do I advance the slide? Just the button here. Page down. You would think that, thank you. When I read Bob's paper, I had two impressions. One is that if there weren't statisticians in this business, we wouldn't have this entire mess. And the other is that that Deming actually set out a lot of these ideas back in 1944 paper called On Errors in Surveys, and he listed 13 sources of potential errors, 23 if you count as subcategories. The title of Deming's article contains the word error, but he framed his problems as factors that affect the usefulness of survey, and that's where I got my talk. As a person who spends much of his time developing questionnaires, item number 5 in Deming's list, imperfection in the questionnaires, sort of jumped out at me. And Deming says, okay, some of the things that we know now, but we've developed a little bit more, refined a little bit more. Lack of clarity in definitions, ambiguity, varying meaning of the same words to different groups of people, eliciting an answer liable to misinterpretation. These are all sources of error or bias. Omitting questions that would be illuminating to the interpretation and so forth. The one that really sort of got to me was the last one, encouraging non-response through a formidable appearance. And it evoked a lot of images of different kinds of interviewers perhaps coming to households and either big hulking weightlifters or sort of matronly looking types. Well, I'm going to give a brief overview of problems and solutions in questionnaire design and try to relate these to the concept of total survey error. And then, in spite of that, talk about the usefulness of survey data, in spite of the fact that we don't know everything about error. I just said that. There are a lot of problems associated with questionnaires that we can add to Deming's list that we know about these days. Violating rules for writing good survey questions, and we all know what those rules are. The problem of memory limitations. We know that respondents forget about events, especially those that are short-lived and not particularly salient. We know that in panel surveys of sensitive topics, reports are inconsistent over time, and in fact, respondents sometimes recant. We might call this selective forgetting. We know that the administration of a questionnaire is also a potential source of problems, the formidable interviewer. Interviewers might affect responses in two different ways. First, in the classic sense, as an interviewer effect, which Bob has pointed out could be modeled, but is not oftentimes done. Secondly, as a potential source of misinterpretation of the question text. In addition, we know that the mere presence of an interviewer can affect responses to attitude questions on social mores. We know that in panel surveys, matching the respondent to the same interviewer over time can affect reporting on sensitive topics. We know due to the study of cognitive aspects of survey responding, we're beginning to understand many of the problems associated with question context. Prior items may affect responses to subsequent ones in many different ways, and responses to prior items may affect responses to subsequent ones. Questions that are ambiguous or that are about obscure issues might be affected particularly. Questions taken in pairs may be seen as violating rules of conversation, affecting responses. Questions that prime some aspect of the self can also affect responses to subsequent questions. Attitude questions on a particular topic that appear on a block may force consistency. We know a lot about improvements. There are a lot of, in many good places, the rules for writing good questions are set down, but they don't always apply. As a matter of fact, when we say we don't want ambiguous questions, sometimes our clients tell us, no, we don't mind ambiguity. One example is that I recently encountered a proposed single question. I don't know how you encounter a question. It's not like encountering a person. And the question asks whether teachers, principal, or other school staff were available if their child was having problems in school. This was a question asked to parents. And I mentioned to the clients that they should pick one. But they said they didn't want to. They didn't care that there was ambiguity. They just wanted to know if somebody was available. So we have a bad question, but information that we hope is useful. We've developed many ways for assessing the quality of questions. We can have our esteemed colleagues look at them. We can do cognitive interviews. We can do field tests that include behavior coding, interviewer debriefing, and looking at response frequencies. But in spite of these methods, it's still hard to know precisely how much error is, how much survey error is reduced, or maybe whether new error is introduced. We don't have really good definitions or standards of quality in many cases. The method of bounded recall or dependent interviewing has been used to reduce telescoping in panel surveys. We don't have a lot of research on how effective it is, but recently it was pointed out that this could encourage satisficing and also cause concerns about privacy. And it may, in fact, while it was meant to improve things, may in fact make them worse in some cases. Calendars or timelines are devices that can improve reporting of event occurrence, but these devices have their limitations. Apparently people don't structure their memory about the dates of event, structure their memory about the occurrence of an event as dates, and new methods that treat past events as if they were stored in narrative form, which might be a more natural way to think of them, are proving useful, but they're more costly. Interviewer training and, if possible, monitoring should reduce misinterpretation. Bob Gross correctly points out in his paper the use of self-administered interviewers has been a big step forward in obtaining better information about sensitive topics. You could argue those of us who, of course, know about these things, which is everybody in the room, know that the use of CASI, can prevent item non-response and such, but people can still sort of give passive item non-response by saying don't know and refuse, and we still suspect that there's underreporting. Unfortunately, sometimes the design of a survey doesn't allow for the ready use of CASI with sensitive topics. Consider the National Survey of Sex Behavior that NORC conducted. Because of the design, the survey was not well suited for the use of CASI because it involved rostering sex partners and collecting information on sensitive behaviors on each one. It'd be hard to do this in a paper and pencil or even a CASI format. So you had to do it in person and take the consequences. There's a lot of stuff about context effects and wording effects that are tricky, but I think the main point is that we can, and often do, try to solve these problems of, whether survey context is going to affect responses or whether question wordings are going to affect responses, interpretation, and such standards of judgment. But and we can do split ballot experiments, but I don't know if that really tells us which is the more accurate outcome, and so we might know something about differences. but we don't really know which is better and which reduces survey error or bias more. In his paper, Bob Groves, like Deming, acknowledges the difficulties of questionnaire design and of modeling the effects of questionnaire design into the total survey error process. He cites examples of the effects of, he mentions in particular some examples that have attempted to do that or could be used to do that. In particular, some of the work by the early work by Sudman and Bradburn, who tried to use an exponential decay function to model forgetting, and he combines work by Huttenlocher and Bradburn and Hedges and Bradburn and Joe and Smith in some way that was inscrutable to me, that indicated you could have a mathematical model that would model the influence of generic and episodic memory on reporting of events. In this case, food consumption, but I imagine it would apply to other events at all. As impressive as these particular studies are, and these attempts to mathematically model the effects of reporting, in essence, there are exceptions to the rule. And while we know that question wording, context, and other aspects of design have an effect on responses, and in some cases we can even document the magnitude of the effect. For most of these effects, we don't have general laws that can predict it. The most we can say is that an improved question or questionnaire might reduce bias, reducing the mean square error, but in most cases we can't say by how much. Let's see where I am. I'm going up. But flawed data can still be useful data. In fact, imperfect survey data, which we all know survey data is, are used with confidence to provide guidance on important social issues. For example, questionnaires that assess drug use are probably prone to gross underreporting, and we don't know how much, but we also know that they can be very useful in telling us things about people's behavior. I think the most elaborate example that I want to talk about has to do with the Consumer Confidence Index and the questions that are involved within it. They're really quite ambiguous and perhaps types of questions that you and I might not like to write, but yet they give useful information. For example, they ask whether respondents, whether they are better or worse off financially now than a year ago. I guess I might be able to answer that if I look on my salary, but I'm not sure about the salary to debt ratio, so I might have to say I don't know. They ask whether people are going to be better off next year than this year. Well, I'd like to think so, but again, if my salary increases, my debt might increase more. They ask whether the country will be better off financially 12 months from now or 5 years from now, and I think not even economists can tell us that. Then they ask whether now is a good time to buy a major household appliance. And well, I guess if my dishwasher breaks, then now would be a good time to buy a major appliance. Yet somehow, through the magic of aggregation, responses to these questions seem to be good predictors of the economy. In their book, The Rational Public, Page and Shapiro show that time and again over 50 years, public opinion in the aggregate is sensitive to social, political, and international changes. I'm out of time, so I have conclusions. Nope, I don't have them on the slide. Here are my conclusions. Is survey data flawed because of questionnaire design? The answer is yes. Deming was right. Do we understand everything about the effects of questionnaire design on survey responses? The answer is no. Can we understand precisely how the subtle effects of question wording, context, reporting period, and mode and other aspects of questionnaire design contribute to total survey error? The answer is probably not, and we may never. But is survey data useful? Well, if there isn't, there wouldn't be an AAPOR.
Now we'll have an opportunity if any of you want to ask any questions, and let me put it this way. If you were able to follow and digest all that without any questions, you're better brains than I have. So, does anyone have any question or comment they want to raise?
Have we? The paper by Mr. Groves will be available, but not quite yet. You could send me an email. I'm on AAPOR directory. Wait a minute, we got to record this. Do you know what Warren just said? Warren just paid a compliment to someone. Thank you, Warren.
I was struck by something that you said, and that is how much effort do we put into improving survey quality versus measuring survey quality. And the other part of that is, here we are all as survey practitioners. What would you like to see us do to help determine total survey error?
Okay, I will repeat the question. Actually, it's a comment, it's a rich set of comments and questions. First, you were intrigued by this notion, as I am, how much money should we spend on measuring quality versus improving quality? I think that was a comment. And the question was a bold question of what do I think you should do?
He asked for it. Tell him.
This is the first time you ever gave me an opportunity like this one. I don't know what the field, that's a huge question. I think what should we put our money on? I do think right now, let me just take non-response because I spend a lot of time on that. I think we have to get serious about mounting studies and embedding things in our design that can inform non-response error, not just rate, because we've lost the rate war in some sense. The public has done that for us. And we won't win the rate contest anymore. And so, and even if you reject that assertion on my part, we know that our mechanisms to increase rates have differential effects. The literature is coming together on that, and so we have to be more intelligent users of those mechanisms. I really think that means that the kind of non-response, auxiliary non-response bias studies ought to become practice in a real way, and that deserves some thought and effort. We'd have to spend money on that, but I actually think the money we'd spend on that is less than the money we spend trying to get high response rates.
Can I comment on that too?
Yeah.
You know, is this on?
Just a real quick comment. I just want to mention that in my experience, it's usually easier to get a respondent to respond twice than a non-respondent to respond once. So I would argue for more re-interview studies.
I've just been told it'll be at least 20 minutes until the dessert is ready, so.
Rebellion.
I had a question for Paul. I really think the correlation there.
I'll repeat it.
The correlation between measured there and response there, face-to-face,
Right.
it's not trivial. 60.6
Yeah.
is not trivial. Face-to-face, we find really a zero correlation. Right? Any speculation why? That pairs seem to rise and fall together face-to-face.
Okay, the question Alan is asking is that in the results that I talked about, we saw this correlation between non-response bias and measurement bias for face-to-face, which was around 0.6 something, 0.65. And then for RDD, we didn't see that correlation. Now, we can speculate on what that means, and I've thought some about it, but I think it's a complex relationship, looking at differences between correlations and trying to understand what's going on there. But one thing I can say is that looking at the estimates that I had of measurement bias, they tend to be very comparable across the modes. Well, what's changing is the non-response patterns. The non-response patterns for face-to-face look very different than they are for RDD. So it's related to the fact that non-response, the whole mechanism of non-response, and what is sort of driving the response propensities in RDD are different than they are for face-to-face. But that's as far as I can go, really, to explain. But it's a good question. Yeah, the gold standard we used for that study, basically, we started with the health interview survey that had a 81% response rate. We went back to those non-respondents from the health interview survey, and we were able to do follow-back interviews on the non-respondents so that we had a cumulative response rate after the follow-up of around 98%. Then we estimated the measurement error, that is, if you think of it as false positives, false negative probabilities associated with the different modes, and we adjusted those estimates for these false positive and false negative. So what we had then was a measure that had a 98% response rate where we removed the measurement bias. That's the gold standard.
We now have a portable mic if any of you want to use it to ask your questions. Over here.
This is for Mr. Groves. Greetings. I wonder if you could use your theoretical insights about total sampling or total error to explain to all of us how during the election all the pre-election polls wildly gyrate during the campaign, and then on election day all seem to come right down to the same estimate in 25 words or less, and no use of timing as an excuse.
Not my area, sorry.
No, you can't back away.
Well, let's see.
Ask him if he can.
One of the things that's clear, it seems to me, it would be good to model those explicitly with just the sampling variance components involved, because some of those are real small sample sizes, so there's volatility just from sample sizes. But everything's going on at once there, so there are house effects. And what do we mean by house effects? Well, it's the cumulative differences on the non-response error components, the impacts of interviewers, and so on. That
House effects are there at the end of the season, too.
yeah, I see. You're saying that. Yeah. Well, David, you're just making me demonstrate my ignorance about this thing. So I won't counter-argue. What would you say to this, David? What?
Well, that's the question that a lot of journalists ask. How is it that we can be wildly fluctuating, get all these wild differences, and show 13-point, 14-point differences, and then it comes down to the election, and we're down within 2 or 3 percentage points? Now, part of it's probably increased sample size, and I don't think timing is a real good thing, but if you take a look at during the campaign, we tell very different stories. The race is going like this, say some of us. The race is going like that, say others of us. But when we come down to it, we have the same prediction, you know, plus or minus 2 points. Now, I'm sure that that's related to your field of study, which is total sampling error. So
I'll get on that right away. Thank you. I'm sorry, I can't help. Oh, there is an answer from the audience.
I'm giving a paper on Saturday morning.
Wait. It's coming.
Thank you. I'm giving a paper on Saturday, I'm not sure whether it's the one in the morning or the afternoon, in which I compare all of the tracking polls done by 2 major news services, Gary Langer's ABC and Michael Butterworth's CBS New York Times polls. 4 tracking polls in one, 27 in the other, and I can show you that the slope from we got all of the data from the end of the Republican convention to the day before the election. The slopes are virtually identical for the 2, and if you factor in the directionality of the results, both of them came within 0.5% of predicting the actual margin of victory in popular vote nationally. So the fluctuations were not as wild as they may have seemed if you just kind of don't look at all the data.
So this is like the old saying, in the land of the blind, the one-eyed man is king here, if we just don't look at all the data?
I don't have an explanation, but I have an hypothesis that could be tested, and that is that some of this may be because of likely voter models. It's easier to estimate likely voters the closer to the election you get, so that it may be that the difference between the different houses' estimates becomes less.
Just to elaborate on that, I mean, uncertainty decreases the closer you get to making the choice. And that's why campaigns actually have meaning. You know, you're more uncertain the farther away you are from the election. The closer you are, the more certain you are of your choice. And certainly there's some samples right there in the next one around here. There's actually a political count as well, which maybe you are missing.
Any last question? Well, it appears for those who are in the front of the room, if you turn around, the desserts have appeared. And I want to thank you all for being a very good audience, and I hope you enjoy the desserts.